You know that moment when you realize the people you gave everything to would watch you drown without lifting a finger? That's where my story begins. I'm Florence, 53 years old, widowed, broke, and slapped in the face by my own daughter at her wedding, in front of 200 people. I used to think I knew what betrayal looked like. I was wrong. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you loved the most, this story is for you. But before we dive in, what's your story? Drop it in the comments. I'm listening. You're not alone. The morning of my daughter's wedding, I stood alone in my empty house in Westchester. The walls were bare, boxes stacked like tombstones, each one holding a piece of the life I'd spent decades building. I didn't want to sell this house. I had to. It was the home where I raised 3 children, where crayon marks on the kitchen door frame marked their growth like a timeline of love. Now I was liquidating it, just to stay afloat. 3 months earlier, I asked my kids for help with the bills left over from my husband's cancer treatments. Jacob didn't even look up from his phone before saying, "You need to downsize anyway, Mom. That place is too big for just you." Jonathan, ever the financial expert, at least in his own eyes, was colder. "We can't enable your poor financial planning," as if spending every dime to try to save their father was some kind of irresponsible whim. That's when I knew I wasn't just broke. I was alone. And today, my youngest daughter, Rebecca, was marrying into wealth. Real wealth. Her fiancé Blake came from pharmaceutical money, the kind that doesn't blink at 6-figure weddings. Meanwhile, I was scraping together gas money to get to the Hamptons for the ceremony. I'd chosen a conservative navy dress, something quiet, forgettable. That felt like my role in this whole charade anyway. Rebecca hadn't asked for my opinion on anything. Not the venue, not the flowers, not even the date. I found out from a late save-the-date card, weeks after her friends had already RSVP'd. She didn't want me involved, she just couldn't leave me out. The 2-hour drive crawled by in thick October traffic. Fall weddings were fashionable now, according to the last brief clipped phone call I'd had with Rebecca. Everything about this day was carefully curated. Farm-to-table catering, Edison bulbs hanging between oak trees, organic flowers flown in from somewhere that definitely wasn't local. It was stunning, expensive, and completely not meant for me. I parked my 10-year-old Honda between a Tesla and a BMW, walked past strangers laughing in designer gowns, found my table, number 12, tucked in the back, away from family. Apparently, I wasn't part of that circle anymore. Family sat at tables 1 through 4. A woman I didn't know, blonde, beaming, a yoga teacher from Santa Barbara, greeted me with, "You must be Rebecca's mom. She talks about you all the time." She didn't, but I smiled anyway, because that's what you do when your heart is breaking and no one notices. The ceremony itself was flawless. Rebecca floated down the aisle in a gown that probably cost more than my next car. She looked beautiful. I felt nothing. Not joy, not pride. Just a hollowness, like I was watching a stranger's wedding. And in a way, I was. The reception was held in a renovated barn with vaulted ceilings and enough string lights to blind a small town. Everyone looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. Perfect teeth, perfect shoes, perfect lives. Everyone except me. I walked in alone, past servers balancing trays of champagne, past clusters of guests who didn't notice me, or worse, noticed and quickly looked away. I checked the seating chart again, hoping it was a mistake. Table 12, still tucked in the back with a group of Rebecca's college friends and their +1s, not a single family member in sight. My sons? Front and center? My place? As far from the head table as possible. Family was tables 1 through 4, and I wasn't family anymore. I sat quietly and nodded politely through introductions. The women at my table made small talk about boutique yoga retreats and destination baby showers. One of them asked what I did for work. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I couldn't bring myself to say nothing. Not because I didn't want to, but because after 30 years of parenting, nursing a husband through terminal illness, selling a home full of memories, I didn't even know how to define myself anymore. Dinner was elegant, microgreens, some kind of sea bass, desserts that looked more like art than food. I couldn't eat, not because it wasn't good, but because my stomach was too full of emotions I couldn't name. Jacob and Jonathan were at the bar, laughing loudly with Blake's groomsmen. They didn't once glance my way. No, "Hey, Mom." No, "How are you holding up?" Nothing. I might as well have been invisible. I saw Rebecca before she saw me, gliding between tables like a celebrity working the room. Her dress shimmered in the candlelight, her smile radiant. When she finally approached, it felt more like obligation than affection. "Mom, you look nice," she said, her eyes already scanning the room for someone more important. "You look beautiful," I replied. "Everything is beautiful." "Thanks. Blake's parents really went all out." There was a pause. A moment where she could have sat down, asked how I was doing, maybe even thanked me for showing up, but she just checked her Cartier watch and said, I should get back to the head table. Toasts are starting soon. And just like that, she was gone. I watched her walk away, her gown trailing behind her like smoke. And I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit for years. My daughter wasn't just distant, she was gone. The girl I raised had grown into a woman I didn't recognize, someone who treated my presence like a mild inconvenience. I sipped my champagne, alone in a room full of people, wondering how I'd become the outsider in a life I helped create. The toasts began just after the main course, and with each speech I felt myself shrink further into my seat. First came Blake's father, warm, confident, welcoming my daughter into his loving and loyal family, words I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Then the best man, stories from college, inside jokes, drunken mishaps everyone found hilarious. I laughed politely, but my heart was already drifting far from the celebration. Then it was my son's turn. Jacob went first. His speech was polished, full of buzzwords like authenticity, empowerment, and resilience. He painted Rebecca as a trailblazer, a woman who always followed her truth. Not once did he mention me, not the woman who drove Rebecca to every dance class, stayed up with her through eating disorder relapses, held her hair when she cried through heartbreaks. Not a word. Then Jonathan, shorter, more transactional. He spoke about how lucky Rebecca was to have found a man who could provide stability and protect her future. Like that's all a woman needs, a financial advisor in a tux. No one mentioned the woman who gave up everything to raise them, not even a nod. And then Rebecca stood up. Her cheeks were flushed from champagne, her smile bright. This was her moment, the one she'd likely scripted in her mind for months. But before she spoke, Blake leaned in and whispered something in her ear. I saw her expression change, her jaw set, her smile twisted into something else, colder, calculating. She looked across the room, right at me, her glass raised, her voice calm, too calm. Before I thank everyone, there's something I need to address. The room stilled, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Some of you might be wondering why my father isn't here to walk me down the aisle today. He passed away 2 years ago. Her voice wavered, just enough to pull sympathy. Then it sharpened. And my mother? She paused. My mother spent every penny he left us on treatments that everyone knew wouldn't work. She was selfish, desperate, and now she expects us to clean up her mess. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded in my ears. Guests turned to look at me, some sympathetic, others curious, a few outright horrified. I want to make it clear, she continued, louder now, that this wedding, this day, this life I'm building with Blake, has nothing to do with her. She made her choices, and now she has to live with them. She turned to me, raised her glass, and walked over. Then, with the grace of someone posing for a camera, She slapped me across the face, hard. The crack echoed, and the silence afterward, deafening. I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I laughed, quiet, steady, a laugh that came from somewhere deeper than pain. It shocked even me, and then I stood up and walked to the microphone, because if she wanted this to be a performance, then it was time I delivered the truth. I took the mic with steady hands, the same hands that had rocked these children to sleep, held their feverish foreheads, and signed away savings to give their father a fighting chance. Rebecca was behind me, her white dress suddenly looking more like a costume. Jacob and Jonathan sat frozen at the head table, Jacob's mouth open, Jonathan's eyes scanning for exits. "Thank you all," I began, my voice calm, even. "Thank you for coming to celebrate my daughter's wedding. Since she's chosen to make this about family finances, I think it's only fair that everyone hears the full picture." The room held its breath. I looked at Blake's parents, pearl-clutching, visibly tense. This wasn't the family drama their pharmaceutical fortune had paid for. "My daughter is 3 months pregnant," I said flatly. "Which is beautiful, of course, except the timing doesn't quite line up with their engagement story." Gasps. Whispers. Blake turned to Rebecca. She was shaking her head, mouthing no over and over. He was pale, silent. "But that's not why I'm standing here," I continued. "I'm standing here because my children think I'm a foolish old woman who wasted their inheritance. What they don't know is that I've spent the last 6 months with a forensic accountant." Jonathan stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Mom, stop." I didn't. When you're facing financial ruin, you start asking questions. You start noticing patterns. I turned to him. 3 years ago, when your father was diagnosed, someone began quietly transferring money from our joint accounts to shell companies. Companies linked to your business address. Eyes widened. Phones came out. People were recording. I turned to Jacob. "Your crypto startup? The one you couldn't explain at dinner? I can explain it. It's called theft. $73,000 charged to my credit cards to buy digital assets hidden in wallets I couldn't access." He stood, furious. "You can't prove that." "Actually," I said, "I can." The room buzzed, nervous chatter, clinking glasses, shocked silence. A wedding turned courtroom. "And Rebecca," I said, finally facing my daughter, "the influencer, the woman who slapped her mother in front of 200 people. She was crying now, mascara running in black rivers. Every sponsored post, every luxury unboxing, every authentic recommendation was paid for with funds from your father's medical account. $47,000 in cosmetic procedures, $12,000 on a Chanel bag, $6,000 on Napa, all while I was holding his hand in hospice." I held up my phone. Screenshots. Bank statements. The crowd was murmuring louder now. Blake had stepped away from Rebecca, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "And the best part?" I finished. "They all thought I'd never notice. That grief made me weak, that I'd stay silent while they picked me clean." I set the microphone back in its stand. The ballroom, once dripping in curated elegance, now felt like a courtroom soaked in shame. I looked at my children, one by one. Then I said the words that changed everything. "I'm done. Not hurt, not bitter, just done." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Not awkward, not confused. It was stunned, like a room that had just realized it was sitting in the middle of a fire, and now the smoke was rising. Rebecca had collapsed into her seat, face buried in her hands, her $1,000 wedding dress crumpled like tissue. Jacob stood frozen, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. Jonathan was already on his phone, probably texting a lawyer or Googling damage control. And Blake? He leaned in close to Rebecca and whispered something that made her flinch. Then he stood up and walked away, without a word. Blake's father, who hadn't moved for most of the ceremony, cleared his throat and said, with corporate calm, I think perhaps this celebration should come to an end. And just like that, the exodus began. Guests grabbed coats, whispered furiously, and avoided eye contact as they made for the exits. Some paused to nod at me in quiet acknowledgement. Others just hustled out, eager to escape before the story followed them. My children approached me, separately now, no longer a pack, just 3 exposed individuals scrambling for control. Jonathan reached me first. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed. I met his gaze, calm, clear. "I didn't destroy anything. I just revealed what was already broken." Jacob grabbed my arm, fingers digging into my skin. "You can't prove any of this. You're a bitter, manipulative old woman." I looked at his hand, then at him. "Take your hand off me, now." He dropped it like it burned. Rebecca came last, her face streaked with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, how could you do this? Today? Of all days?" I stared at her, really stared, and for the first time I saw her clearly, not as my daughter, not as a victim of grief, but as the architect of her own destruction. "The same way you could steal from your father's medical fund while he was dying," I said. "The same way you could slap your mother across the face in front of strangers. The same way you stood in front of 200 people and called me selfish for trying to save the man who gave you life." She looked shattered, but I didn't feel cruel. I felt clean. "You can cry. You can scream. You can spin the story however you want, but we both know the truth, and the truth has a way of following you home." As the last of the guests cleared out, I turned away from all 3 of them and walked to my car. I didn't look back, because this wasn't a goodbye, it was a closing chapter. And as I drove north toward Vermont, toward Oscar, the farm, and a quiet life that had been waiting patiently for me, I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was my beginning. Oscar was waiting on the porch when I pulled into the farm driveway, a mug of coffee in one hand, a blanket in the other, like he somehow knew exactly when I'd arrive and what I'd need. He always knew. "How'd it go?" he asked as I stepped out of the car, still in the navy dress, now wrinkled and stained with the weight of the day. "Better than expected," I said, accepting the coffee. "Worse than they deserved." We didn't say much that night. We didn't have to. Oscar had known me for 30 years. He was the one person who hadn't taken a single thing from me. Not love, not money, not time. Only ever gave. In the weeks that followed, my phone became a battlefield. Jacob called me vindictive. Jonathan threatened legal action. Rebecca sobbed in voicemails about how I'd ruined her life. I listened to the first few, then I stopped. There's only so much begging and blame you can absorb before it starts to sound like static. Oscar never asked me to explain. He just handed me fencing gloves or a feed bucket or pointed out a birthing schedule on the clipboard in the barn. He gave me work, purpose, space. He also gave me a proposition. "The county wants me to find a partner," he said one morning, mucking out a stall. "I'd like that partner to be you." I blinked. "You mean in the practice?" "In everything," he said simply. "But you don't have to answer today." He didn't pressure. He never did. That was what made the offer real. Not a demand, not a rescue. A choice. And for the first time in years, I had one. 6 months passed. I moved into the farmhouse full-time. Got relicenced as a vet. Took over emergency calls and routine care. Word spread quickly. Oscar's partner, Dr. Florence, not just a grieving widow, not just a broken mother, a woman rebuilding. And then, on a calm autumn morning, coffee in hand, Oscar asleep upstairs, I opened my laptop. The forensic accountant had sent everything: spreadsheets, transfer histories, shell corporations, fake invoices, all of it. $347,000 stolen, over 3 years, while I was grieving. But I didn't cry. Instead, I sent 3 emails. The first went to the IRS, detailing unreported income, fraudulent business activity, and tax evasion tied to each of my children. The second went to the New York State Attorney General's office, outlining Jonathan's theft from elderly clients. Yes, it wasn't just me. The third went to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, exposing Jacob's crypto scams, the cross-state transactions, the fake investors. I didn't write a manifesto. I didn't add threats. I simply attached the truth. Then I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and watched the sun set over the hills of the farm I now co-owned. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt free, because this wasn't revenge. It was reality finally catching up. 3 months passed. The phone was silent. No calls from Jacob, whose cryptocurrency empire had crumbled into debt, lawsuits, and federal investigations. No voicemails from Jonathan, whose consulting firm collapsed when the truth about his investment strategies started circulating among his clients, many of whom were now preparing to sue. No more sobbing messages from Rebecca, whose carefully curated influencer life fell apart with every unfollow, every eviction notice, every unreturned brand partnership. But that wasn't what brought peace. Peace came in smaller moments. A sunrise over frost-covered fields, the quiet grunt of a mare ready to foal. Oscar's hand wrapped around mine after a long day. No performance, no manipulation, just real life. 1 year after that infamous wedding, I stood in a small courthouse in Vermont, wearing a simple cream dress, holding Oscar's hand. The ceremony was quiet. No guests, no photographers, no spectacle. Just two people choosing each other, not for status, not out of obligation, but out of love, earned the hard way. We drove back to the farm, our farm now, where the maples had turned the hills into fire, and we got right back to work. That night, we helped deliver twin calves on the Morrison property. Lantern light, fresh straw, new life, no wedding cake, just something better, purpose. Afterwards, we sat on the porch, the stars overhead so bright they looked painted on. No regrets? Oscar asked. I sipped my coffee and thought about everything I'd walked away from, and everything I'd walked toward. Charlie used to say regret was just pride refusing to let go, I replied. But pride didn't build this life. Honesty did. Because if I'd stayed, I'd still be funding Rebecca's lies, still be justifying Jonathan's theft, still be crying in silence while Jacob drained my accounts. Forgiveness is for people who show remorse. Accountability is for everyone else. Later that week, I opened the final documents from the forensic accountant. More evidence, more victims, a pattern of theft stretching back years. So I sent one last round of emails, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, out of duty. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was protecting every future person they might try to manipulate, scam, or emotionally bleed dry. And just when I thought it was over, my phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. I had the baby, a girl. I named her Florence after you. I hope someday you'll want to meet her. I showed Oscar. He read it, raised an eyebrow, and said nothing. She named her after the woman she stole from, I said, deleting the message. Even now, he said, she thinks your name will fix what she broke. I looked out at the land, the fence we'd repaired that morning, the livestock we cared for, the life we built from nothing but love and grit. If her daughter grows up to be like her, I said, she'll learn the same thing all my children learned. Actions have consequences, because that's the truth no one wants to hear. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's a trap. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away. If this story hit something deep, if you've ever been betrayed, cut off, or had to choose peace over people, drop a comment below. I want to know where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to walk away from someone who no longer deserved access to your life, you're not alone, and your story matters. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. We tell the kind of stories most people are too afraid to say out loud, raw, real, unfiltered. Because sometimes healing starts when you realize someone else has been there too.